She had buried her husband with one hand on her belly and the other on a shovel. Now, with nothing left but land and silence, someone unexpected was riding toward her fence line. Evelyn Monroe didn't cry when the wind tore another splinter from the raw meat of her palms. Her hands, red and swollen, gripped the rusted pliers with a defiance that wasn't brave, just empty. Grief had hollowed her out long before this moment. Ever since the prairie took Tom, first his breath, then his voice, and finally his body, tears had felt useless. She had none left to waste on pain. Not when the fence was down again. Not when the cattle had scattered. Not with winter whispering from the ridgeline. The sun bore down like judgment as she squatted near the sagging post, her swollen belly pushing against her thighs. 6 months gone, and already she felt like time was dragging her towards something she wasn't sure she wanted. The baby kicked once, sharp and strong, and Evelyn gritted her teeth. "I know," she muttered. "I'm trying." The fence was old, like everything else Tom had left her. Dry rot in the posts, barbed wire curling like dead snakes in the grass. The hammer she used was her father's before her husband's, the handle worn smooth by generations of stubborn men. But now it was Evelyn gripping the handle, her bare feet rooted in cracked earth, hair plastered to her cheeks with sweat and grit. In town they said she was crazy to stay. "She'll sell before the baby comes. Can't keep up that place alone. Poor thing, don't know when to quit." But Evelyn knew quitting. She'd watched it happen to her father after her mother died, watched him drown in drink and bitterness, until he barely recognized the daughter feeding him soup. Tom had been different. Kind. Dreamy even. But dreams didn't fix fences or pay taxes or bring water to dry soil. So she hammered. Alone. Until the distant crunch of hooves made her straighten with a wince. She turned her head slowly, squinting into the haze of heat rising off the hills. A figure approached, tall in the saddle, horse moving at a steady, unhurried pace. No dust cloud, just presence. When he finally stopped a few yards from the fence line, Evelyn didn't speak. Neither did he. The man dismounted like the saddle knew him well. Worn leather, soft boots, sun-dark hands resting loose on the reins. His face was weathered, not old, but marked by time and silence. He didn't take off his hat, didn't offer his name. Just looked at her, really looked, like he was measuring something that couldn't be spoken out loud. "Fence line's buckled," he said finally, his voice low and even. Evelyn's lip twitched. "Notice that?" He nodded once, eyes moving to her hands. "Wire'll tear deeper if you don't wrap 'em." She turned back to the fence. "I ran out of rags," a pause, then the creak of his saddlebag opening. A clean strip of cotton dropped beside her boot. "I got more," he said simply. She stared at it, then at him. "I'm not looking for charity." Didn't offer any. They stood in that dusty stillness a while longer, Evelyn breathing hard, the baby shifting inside her, the stranger's shadow long and unmoving on the dry earth. Then, without another word, he mounted his horse and rode off the way he came. Only later, as she wrapped the cloth around her bleeding hand and watched the wind carry his dust trail over the ridge, did she wonder why the gesture had shaken her more than all the pitying stares in town combined. The next time he came, it was early morning, the kind of quiet that only exists before the sun has fully claimed the sky. Mist still curled low around the base of the cottonwoods, and Evelyn was already at the fence, sleeves rolled, hands bandaged with the last of her dish rags. Her hammer hung heavy at her hip, and sweat had already begun to bloom beneath her arms despite the chill. She didn't hear him approach this time, just felt it, the way the air shifted when someone else stepped into it. She looked up, startled, as he came into view, leading his horse with one hand and holding a dented metal jug in the other. He didn't speak at first, just offered the jug in her direction. Condensation clung to the outside like silver. Cold water. She didn't move to take it. "I'm not dying of thirst," she said flatly. He didn't shrug, didn't argue. Just set the jug on a flat rock near the post she'd been struggling with. "It's cold," he said. "Thought you might like it." She bristled at the easy calm in his voice, the way he didn't try to explain himself, didn't offer her the soft, sorry eyes she'd grown used to, didn't stare at her belly like most did before lowering their gaze in awkward silence. "What do you want?" she asked, hand resting on the post, fingers stiff with ache. He gestured lazily toward the coiled barbed wire lying tangled at her feet. "Barbed wire bites worse when you bleed on it," he said, tone light but not mocking. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm managing. I can see that." She narrowed her eyes at him. He wasn't young, but he wasn't old either. Somewhere in the middle, like the land itself. Worn and weather-beaten, but not broken. His boots were scuffed, His shirt collar frayed, but there was a quiet steadiness about him, like he didn't need to say much to take up space. His gaze never wandered, never lingered where it shouldn't, but held hers as if they'd already had this conversation 100 times. "Name's Calder," he said finally. "I didn't ask." He nodded. "Didn't think you would." He stood there a minute longer, not moving to help, not offering to fix anything, just watching her, the way a man watches weather roll in from the hills. Not afraid, not eager, just aware. Present. Something about that made Evelyn more uncomfortable than if he'd offered her $100 or tried to take her tools. Her pride rose sharp in her throat, bitter from months of being spoken to like she was made of glass. "You can ride back now," she said. He didn't answer, just gave a small nod, turned, and mounted up again in one smooth motion. She watched him ride off down the ridgeline, his silhouette disappearing behind the low rise where the fence sagged into shadows. The jug still sat on the rock, sweating in the heat that had begun to rise with the sun. She didn't touch it at first, but as the day wore on and her breath grew ragged, she finally lifted it and drank. It was colder than she expected, sharper too, and as she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and stared after the empty horizon, it struck her that Calder Boone hadn't looked at her with pity, not once. He'd seen her pain, sure, but he hadn't made it smaller with sympathy. He'd simply let it be. It was the first time in months she didn't feel like a walking wound. The dream came just before dawn, soft and warm like the breath of summer. Tom was there, whole, grinning, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his hands rough but gentle on her belly. He was laughing, that easy kind of laugh he used to have before the sickness hollowed out his cheeks. In the dream, he was staining the porch railing and humming off-key, and when she stepped into the doorway, he kissed her like he had all the time in the world. "It's gonna be good," he whispered against her skin. "This ranch, this life, it's ours." Evelyn woke with the sound of his voice still clinging to the corners of her mind. For a moment she didn't breathe, afraid that if she moved, she'd forget the timbre of it. But reality crept in like frost under a door. Her back ached, her hands throbbed, and the baby pushed low against her ribs as if reminding her, "You're still here." The house was quiet, the way it had been for months. Just the tick of the wall clock and the faint rustle of wind through the cracked window pane. She sat up slowly, pushing aside the worn quilt, and winced as her bare feet touched the cold floorboards. Every muscle hurt, the kind of hurt that settled deep in the bones. But there was work to be done. There was always work. She pulled on her boots, grabbed her gloves, and stepped out into the light. The morning sun bled gold across the fields, casting long shadows from the skeletal remains of the fence posts. She didn't notice it at first, not until she rounded the barn. There, leaning neatly against the old hitching rail, was a stack of fresh lumber, straight, clean boards, enough to rebuild the worst of the fence line. Evelyn stopped mid-step, eyes narrowing. She walked slowly toward the pile, as if it might disappear if she blinked too hard. No note, no tracks in the dust, no sound of hoofbeats fading down the trail. Just the wood waiting. She touched one of the planks, running her fingers over the smooth edge, the scent of freshly cut pine rising sharp in her nostrils. Her jaw tightened. Calder. Of course it was him. No one else would bother. The folks in town had made their judgments clear, some even circling her ranch like vultures, ready to swoop if she dared give up. But this wasn't pity. It wasn't charity with strings attached. It was something else. Something quieter. Harder to name. Her pride flared hot in her chest. She hadn't asked for help. Didn't want to owe anyone. Especially not a man. Especially not one who made her feel seen when all she wanted was to disappear. She looked toward the hills, half expecting to spot him there, watching. But there was nothing. Just the wind and the steady hum of insects waking with the day. Her resentment burned for a moment longer before softening at the edges, curling in on itself like smoke. Maybe not all men expected thanks. Maybe some just left lumber where it was needed and rode away before the sunrise could catch them. The morning was cooler than usual, the sky streaked with pale threads of silver as the first light crept over the ridge. Evelyn was already up, kneeling beside the porch with a tin bucket and a cracked brush, scrubbing yesterday's mud from her boots. The lumber Calder had left had done more than rebuild the fence. It had stirred something restless in her, something she hadn't felt since Tom died. Not hope exactly, just motion. Like the wheels inside her had started turning again, slow and rusty but moving all the same. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw him. A steady rhythm, not urgent, not lazy, just deliberate. She didn't look up when he stopped at the gate this time. Didn't speak as he swung down from the saddle and tied the reins loose against the post. Her eyes stayed on the mud-caked sole of her boot until he cleared his throat. "I brought seeds," he said. That made her glance up. He held a burlap pouch in one hand, worn soft at the corners, the top cinched with twine. She raised an eyebrow. "You got room for squash down by the creek," he added, nodding toward the low ground near the orchard. She didn't reply, just stood slowly, brushed the dust from her knees, and turned toward the house. At the door, she paused, looked over her shoulder, and gave a short nod. Inside, the air was still heavy with the scent of wood smoke and last night's beans. She set the kettle on the stove, the silence between them settling like dust in the corners. He didn't make himself at home, just stood near the door until she gestured toward a chair. He sat without speaking. She poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed him one. They drank without words. The only sounds the soft clink of ceramic and the ticking of the wall clock. It should have been awkward. But it wasn't. After a long stretch, Calder spoke again, his voice quieter now, like he wasn't sure it needed saying. "I used to plant a lot. Had rows of corn, beans, even tried melons once. My wife loved melons." Evelyn didn't look at him, just took another sip of her coffee, waiting. "She died," he said, 10 winters back. Baby didn't make it either. Stillborn." He paused. "I stopped planting things after that." She let the words settle between them, slow and heavy. No gasp, no murmured sympathy, just breath. "I don't have time to stop," she said finally. He turned his head slightly, eyes scanning the chipped rim of his mug. Then, for the first time, something shifted in the lines of his face. A twitch of the mouth, a faint lift at the corner. It wasn't a grin, but it was something close, something real. Outside, the wind stirred the curtains, carrying the scent of earth and riverweed through the cracked window. Evelyn didn't ask him to stay, and he didn't ask if he could. But when she stood and walked to the porch, he followed. Together they looked out across the stretch of land where her future was buried in dry soil and broken dreams. And neither said a word about how squash might grow there after all. The sky warned her, but she was too stubborn to listen. The clouds had rolled in thick and fast, the kind that turned daylight to dusk in minutes. She'd been in the south pasture when the wind snapped a gate clean off its hinge and sent it flying like a paper sheet into the grass. The cattle spooked, crashing into each other, hooves kicking up dirt as the first crack of thunder split the sky. By the time Evelyn reached the barn, the rain had already begun, thick and unforgiving. Within moments it was a wall of water, the kind that drowns, the kind that doesn't ask permission. She shoved the doors open and nearly slipped in the mud, calling for the goats first, then the mule, her voice half lost beneath the howling wind. The roof groaned above her, timbers shuddering under the weight of the downpour. When the lightning struck the ridge behind the barn, the flash lit up the interior in stark, terrifying white. She saw the crack in the ceiling just before it gave way, a section of the old roof collapsing, wood splintering, rain gushing in like a waterfall. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She just moved because if she stopped, something would die. The pen latch was jammed, and she had to dig through thick clumps of soaked straw to find the rope, fingers numb and trembling. One goat was already panicked, bleeding wildly, another wedged into the corner. She tugged hard, belly tight with the effort, every breath sharp like broken glass. The baby inside her kicked again, hard. A protest or a reminder, she couldn't tell. By the time she got them into the lean-to, the wind had shifted direction, blowing sideways sheets of rain that soaked her to the skin. Her braid came loose, hair plastering to her face. Her lungs burned. Her hands bled. That's when she fell, knees buckling into the mud, her vision blurring at the edges. She caught herself on all fours, panting, throat raw. And then, through the water and chaos, she saw him. Calder. He stepped through the storm like he'd been part of it all along. Coat soaked, rope slung over one shoulder, hat pulled low. His eyes found hers in the dark, lightning flashing just behind him. He didn't say anything, didn't ask what needed doing. He just moved toward the fence line where the cattle had scattered, nodding once before tossing her one end of the rope. The heat thickened as July crept forward, pressing down on the valley like a hand that wouldn't lift. The creek ran slower now, its song quieter, more strained. Evelyn moved slower, too. Her belly was a burden she bore with clenched teeth and quiet determination, her steps heavy, her breath short. But still she worked. The fence line had held through the storm. The goats were safe. The barn had a patched roof, and the garden, her garden, was showing signs of life. Squash blossoms flared bright and stubborn among the weeds. Each evening, after the chores were done, she would sit on the porch with her boots unlaced and a cup of lukewarm coffee, staring at the horizon. Tom's memory had become quieter, too. Less of a wound, more of a scar, something healed but never smooth. She didn't expect Calder that night. He hadn't come by in almost a week, and she'd told herself it didn't matter. But when she saw him riding up the path, something in her chest shifted. Not surprise, not relief either, just something that made her sit up straighter. He rode slower than usual, not hesitant, just thoughtful. When he dismounted, he didn't tie off his horse or remove his hat. He stepped onto her porch like a man stepping across an invisible line, one he hadn't dared cross before. In his hand was a rolled-up piece of parchment, tied with a strip of leather. She watched as he laid it gently on her table beside the tin coffee pot. She stared at it for a long moment before touching it. The paper was dry, thick, real. She untied the leather and unrolled it with careful fingers. It was a deed, the land description written in a precise hand, his name at the bottom, a notary's stamp in the corner. She looked up slowly. "What is this?" "My northern acres," he said. "Past the second ridge. Fertile ground. Water runs steady even in dry years." She stared at him. "You're giving it to me? If you want it, it's yours." The paper trembled in her hands, though her fingers held tight. "Why?" she whispered. He looked down at the porch floorboards as if they held the answer. Then he met her eyes, steady and quiet as always. "Because land should belong to someone who won't let it die." Her breath caught. Not from the baby this time. From the weight of the offer. From the weight of being seen. She thought of the years ahead, of raising her child in soil that hadn't given up, of planting things that might last longer than a season. She thought of Tom, of the dreams they'd held and how they'd slipped like sand through her fingers. Then she thought of Calder, the way he never asked for thanks, the way he showed up when no one else would, the way he didn't try to fix her, only stood near while she fixed herself. The words came slow, thick. "You're not afraid I'll ruin it?" He shook his head once. "No, I've seen what you can keep alive." She looked down at the paper again, eyes blurring. "All right," she said, voice low. "I'll take it." And for the first time since she'd buried her husband, something in her felt like it had just begun. The pain came like a thief, fast, sharp, and without warning. One moment Evelyn was checking the fence along the north edge of the new land Calder had given her, palm grazing the dry wood as her eyes scanned the squash vines crawling across the creek bed. The next, her knees buckled beneath her, and the breath was ripped clean from her lungs. She fell hard, the rough ground scraping her palms. A scream caught somewhere between her throat and her teeth. It was too early. She knew that. Too soon for labor. Too soon for the child she hadn't dared picture fully yet. She curled around her belly, gasping, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. Another contraction tore through her. This one longer, deeper, and she cried out, not from weakness, but from the terrifying truth that she couldn't do this alone. And then, somehow, Calder was there. She didn't hear him ride up, didn't see him cross the field. He just appeared beside her like the storm had all those weeks ago, kneeling in the dirt without a word, his hand steady on her shoulder. His face was pale under the brim of his hat, his mouth a tight line. But his eyes held something fierce and unshakable. "I'll get you to Mary," he said, referring to the midwife in town. His voice didn't tremble. She tried to speak, to argue, to say she needed to check the goats, or at least lock the gate, but the pain came again and swallowed her whole. Calder lifted her like she weighed nothing, one arm beneath her legs, the other at her back. She could feel the wetness of his shirt against her cheek as he carried her to the wagon, the reins already in place, the old mare snorting at the sudden urgency. The ride was a blur. Dust rising behind them, Evelyn drifting in and out of consciousness, pain like fire licking at her spine. She gripped Calder's hand when she could feel it, and when she couldn't, she gripped the edge of the wagon until her knuckles turned white. He spoke to her in quiet tones, words she barely caught. "Almost there. Stay with me. You're not alone." They reached the midwife's cottage just as the sun dipped behind the hills. Mary opened the door before he could knock, took one look at Evelyn and barked orders. Calder didn't follow inside. He didn't ask to. He just took off his hat and sat on the bench outside the door, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on nothing but the dirt between his boots. He sat there all night. Once Mary came out, her apron stained, her expression tight. "It's going to be hard," she said. "But she's fighting." He nodded, said nothing. The baby's cry came at sunrise, thin and strong, cutting through the quiet like the first breeze after a long drought. Calder exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. And for the first time since he buried his wife 10 winters ago, his eyes filled. Not loud or wild, just slow tears that slipped down his cheeks without shame. Inside, Evelyn cradled the tiny, red-faced girl against her chest, her body trembling from the effort, her hair stuck to her forehead with sweat. She looked down at the child, fingers brushing a cheek the size of a plum. "Hope," she whispered. Not after Tom. Not after herself, but after something older. Something she thought she'd buried in that field months ago, alongside her belief in love, in soil, in beginnings. And now here she was, holding it again. Alive, breathing, real. The house on Calder's land wasn't big. 2 rooms, slanted floors, and windows that rattled when the wind got mean. But it stood strong against the elements, just like its owner. Evelyn moved in a week after Hope was born, cradling the baby against her chest as Calder unloaded her things from the wagon without asking twice. He didn't tell her she was welcome. He didn't need to. The invitation had been there since the moment he first handed her a jug of water without asking for anything back. The first days were quiet, threaded with the kind of silence that feels more like rest than absence. Calder fixed the door hinges and added a latch to the crib he'd built by hand. Evelyn scrubbed the hearth and hung the little blue quilt her mother had once sewn across the cradle's edge. Hope slept through most of it, cheeks full and warm, her tiny breath the steady rhythm that filled the house with something new. Peace. They planted squash along the creek bed, just like he'd said. Corn, too. Tomatoes. Beans. Evelyn knelt in the dirt, Hope strapped to her chest, digging into soil that felt rich with something more than water and ash. Life grew there. Not just plants, but laughter and routines, and the slow relearning of how to exist beside someone without bracing for loss. They moved like they'd always done it, him chopping wood while she washed laundry on the porch, her shelling peas while he mended tack under the awning. At night, she'd feed Hope while Calder read quietly by the hearth, his voice low and steady, even when the baby was too young to understand a word. The house smelled of wood smoke and stew, of sweetgrass Calder hung in the rafters, of baby powder and worn leather, of resilience, of home. The townspeople, of course, noticed. They spoke with sideways glances and sharp little smiles. "Looks like Evelyn found herself a man after all," they'd say over sacks of flour and fence posts. That old Boone land's not so quiet anymore. She heard it all, let it wash over her like creek water, cold, passing, gone. Because they didn't know. They didn't know Calder never reached for her hand first. Never called her his. Never stepped into the space between them unless she made room. He didn't rescue her, didn't smother her with promises. He built a fire and waited beside it. He didn't ask her to lean. He just never stepped away. And sometimes, that was the greatest kind of love a person could offer. At dusk, they'd sit on the porch, Hope curled in Evelyn's arms, Calder whittling or watching the horizon. Sometimes they spoke about the crops, about the coming frost, about how the creek was running lower than last year. Other times they said nothing at all, just sat in that soft silence, watching the sky burn itself into night. And under their feet, in the soil that had seen death and drought and disappointment, something grew, steady and slow, rooted in truth. Not a rescue, a return. The wind still came strong across the prairie, but Evelyn had long since stopped flinching at it. Years had passed, soft and hard all at once, carving themselves into the land, into the wood of the porch rails, into the lines around her eyes. She still woke early, before the sun, but now it was off into the sound of Hope laughing, chasing chickens barefoot in the yard with her braids trailing behind her like ribbons in the wind. The ranch had grown, not just in fields or fences, but in spirit. The northern acres were no longer just a stretch of land. They were home. They held stories in their soil. Not just Tom's memory or Evelyn's pain, but Hope's first steps, her first words, her first fall from the swing Calder had built with his own hands, carving her name into the frame before hanging it from the wide oak down by the creek. It swayed there now, back and forth, even when she wasn't on it, as if remembering. Evelyn still patched the fences, not because they were falling apart, but because it gave her peace. She liked the way her hands felt in the work, calloused but capable. She liked the smell of fresh cedar posts and oiled wire. The barbed tips didn't bite as sharply anymore. Not with gloves. Not with time. She often found herself humming as she walked the perimeter, the same tune Tom used to whistle, now nearly forgotten by everyone but her. Calder didn't speak more than he used to, but he didn't need to. His presence had become part of the rhythm of her days. He carved when the chores were done, usually by the fire. He added to the swing when Hope outgrew it. He planted a second row of beans the summer Evelyn's back gave out for a week, then never mentioned it. The house still smelled of wood smoke and earth and life, everything she'd once thought she'd lost. One evening, as the sky bled into rust and lavender and the prairie folded itself gently into night, Evelyn stood at the edge of the pasture, watching Hope race across the grass with her arms spread wide. Calder stood beside her, quieter than usual, a small knife in one hand, a half-whittled figure in the other. His shoulders were broader now, or maybe she just saw him differently. More weathered, more worn, but steady. She turned to him, watching the sunset catch in his beard, and said softly, "You didn't give me land, Calder." He looked at her then, brow lifted just enough for her to see he was listening. "You gave me something to believe in." The moment stretched, warm, quiet, filled with the breath of things unspoken. Then Calder looked out toward the field, where Hope had fallen into the tall grass and was laughing so hard she could barely get back up. He smiled, slow and tired and honest. "You gave it to yourself," he said, just above a whisper. "I just left the gate open." The stars came out one by one as the wind carried Hope's laughter across the pasture. Evelyn leaned into Calder's side, not out of need, but because she could, because they were both still standing after everything. And sometimes the fences you build are not to keep the world out, but to hold the good things in.